So this video is going to talk about control of blood pressure and blood flow. There are four major mechanisms that are responsible for controlling blood pressure and blood flow throughout the body. The first is the cardiovascular center, which is the portion of the central nervous system that controls the heart and also applies some control to major blood vessels. And so this is something that is going to be systemic. The second is neural regulation, which is also going to be systemic. The third is hormonal regulation, which is systemic. And the fourth is autoregulation, which is not systemic, it's actually local. So let's talk about the cardiovascular center first. The main portion of the brain that's devoted to the cardiovascular center is the medulla oblongata. Now, unlike what you hear in the movie Waterboy, the medulla oblongata is not responsible for anger, fear, jealousy, and aggression. So he's wrong. Of course, Bobby was wrong too. And so what is it that the medulla oblongata is responsible for controlling? Well, first of all, it's going to receive input from higher cortical centers. So think of recognizing something that's really stressful and then your heart kicks up in terms of force of contraction and rate of contraction. That's because the medulla has received input from higher cortical centers that recognize something that's stressful or dangerous. So these higher cortical centers are going to be the cerebral cortex, the limbic system, and the hypothalamus. So all of these will actually send input to the medulla oblongata. The medulla also receives input from sensory receptors, and those sensory receptors are going to be proprioceptors, which detect changes in body position, baroreceptors, which detect changes in the pressure in the bloodstream, and chemoreceptors, which of course respond to different chemicals that are in the bloodstream. Okay, so let's talk about the cardiovascular system in terms of output and in terms of input. So, output first. Okay, so the sympathetic nervous system has got cardiac accelerator nerves, and these are nerves that actually connect directly to the heart. And so you've got some input to the sinoatrial node, which can increase the heart rate. And you've also got nervous system input to the myocardium itself, which is going to increase the force of contraction. In other words, increase cardiac contractility. In terms of output, you also have sympathetic input to smooth muscle and blood vessels. This is something that's called baseline vasomotor tone. Now, given that there are more vasomotor nerves to skin and abdominal viscera, there's more of the sympathetic output to the skin and the abdominal viscera than in other locations. So this is where you see your vasomotor nerves, your sympathetic vasomotor nerves in action. Now, the third type of output to effectors is the vagus nerves. So these other two things that we've actually seen, the cardiac accelerator nerves and the vasomotor nerves, these are part of the sympathetic nervous system. So with the accelerator nerves, of course, you increase the rate of contractility of the heart. With the blood vessels, you increase vasoconstriction. With the parasympathetic input to the heart, you get decreased rate. So this is going to be both the vagus nerve and cranial nerve 10, and it decreases heart rate. So the reason why there is no decrease in the contractility of the heart is because there's actually not parasympathetic innervation in the myocardium. In other words, the myocardium simply lacks the nerves running to it from the vagus nerve. And so this is the reason why if you get a sudden scare or if you get really angry and your heart rate and the force of contraction of the heart really speeds up, you're going to have this really rapid, hard heartbeat. And as you begin to calm down from that, your heart rate will slow pretty fast, but you may have noticed that the contractility of the heart actually remains strong for quite some time after the rate has slowed down. And the reason why is you have sympathetic innervation to the sinoatrial node and to the myocardium. With the vagus nerve, it does innervate the sinoatrial node and can force a slowing, but what it's not going to be able to do is cut down on the contractility of the myocardium because it simply doesn't have nerves that go there. as far as input to the cardiovascular system goes, there are going to be a number of different inputs there. We've already discussed from the higher brain centers, and the next thing that we're going to discuss is we're going to talk about proprioceptors, baroreceptors, and Okay, so there are three major locations for the pressure-sensitive sensory receptors: the aorta, the internal carotid arteries, and other large arteries in the neck and thorax. And so these locations are something that I hope makes sense to you. Having the baroreceptors in the arch of the aorta give you a picture of your blood pressure when blood leaves the left ventricle. So at this point, you're going to be able to assess what your absolute highest blood pressure actually is. Having baroreceptors in the carotid sinus and other large arteries in the neck is going to be able to allow you to assess the amount of pressure that's coming to the arteries that are feeding the brain. And so having an idea of what the blood pressure is entering the brain may help to cut down on the chance of strokes. Okay, so the first thing to talk about is what's called the aortic reflex, and this happens when baroreceptors that are located in the ascending aorta and in the aortic arch get stimulated by these sinuses stretching. And so this is something that's going to indicate increased blood pressure. The greater the degree of stretch in the aorta and in the aortic arch is going to indicate increased blood pressure. Now, this may be a blood pressure that is hazardous over the long term, and so these baroreceptors contain pressure-gated sodium channels, and so when those channels are put under stress, sodium will come in, it'll cause an action potential, and they'll send signals to the cardiovascular center. And so what they're sending is afferent impulses to the cardiovascular center that's in the medulla via the vagus nerve. And if you'll recall from last semester, the vagus nerve is one of those nerves that can carry both afferent and efferent impulses. So they're sending afferent impulses to the cardiovascular center here. With the carotid sinus reflex, the internal carotid arteries get stimulated by a stretch of those sinuses, and again, this is something that is going to indicate an increased blood pressure. And so once you hit a certain level of blood pressure, again, same thing happens. Pressure-gated channels are going to open in these receptor cells, and it's going to set off an action potential, and these will actually send afferent impulses to the cardiovascular center via the glossopharyngeal nerve. And so you've got different pathways from the aortic arch versus the carotid sinus. So when you get this increased stretch of baroreceptors and increased transmission to the cardiovascular center, what is it that actually happens? Well, first of all, you get increased parasympathetic impulses, and what this is going to do is this is going to decrease the heart rate. But you're also going to get decreased sympathetic impulses. Now, here's the thing. The sympathetic impulses are going to affect blood vessel smooth muscle. Okay? The sympathetic impulses are going to cause an increase in vasomotor tone. So you'll have an increased amount of vasoconstriction. Now, when those sympathetic impulses are decreased, they're not telling the blood vessels to constrict quite as much. So you have a sort of relative vasodilation. It's not an active vasodilation, but it's more of a passive vasodilation where you have lessened vasoconstriction. Now, when these things happen, when you decrease your heart rate, you decrease the cardiac output. When you decrease when you have this relative vasodilation, you're going to decrease your systemic vascular resistance. And these two things together are going to result in decreased blood pressure. Now, if you have a decreased stretch of baroreceptors, so let's say that there's hardly any stretch at all, you get less impulse transmission to the cardiovascular center. And in this case, with getting fewer action potentials, fewer impulses, the cardiovascular center is going to say, basically, There's hardly any stretch going on here, therefore blood pressure must be relatively low. And in this case, the cardiovascular center will respond by decreasing the parasympathetic output. So these signals that are going out to decrease the heart rate will lessen. At the same time, the cardiovascular will increase the sympathetic output. And so what this will result in is increased heart rate, increased contractility, vasoconstriction of peripheral blood vessels, and also the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine from the adrenal medulla, which is itself going to cause vasoconstriction of some peripheral blood vessels. So when your systemic vascular resistance increases because of the vasoconstriction, and as your cardiac output increases, then you're going to get an increase in blood pressure. So let's take a look at this in one of our figures that talks about homeostasis. And so blood pressure is one of the characteristics that needs to be maintained in a specific range. So blood pressure is a homeostatic variable. So that means that you're going to have mechanisms in place to address high blood pressure and mechanisms in place to address low blood pressure. So let's see what happens when our imbalance happens on the plus side. So blood pressure rises above normal range, and that's number one here, the stimulus. Well, what's going to happen is number two, the baroreceptors in the carotid sinuses and the aortic arch, these get stimulated. They're going to send impulses to the cardioinhibitory center and send impulses to the cardioacceleratory center. But what they're going to do is they're going to stimulate cardioinhibition and inhibit cardioacceleration. Basically what that means is they're going to slow down the impulses that say speed up the heart. They're going to speed up the impulses that say slow down the heart. So as a result, heart rate slows. Okay? And they're also going to inhibit the vasomotor center. So taking a look at these two actions, first of all, 4A, if you get decreased sympathetic impulses to the heart, you cause a lower heart rate, lower contractility, lower cardiac output. In 4B, your lowered rate of vasomotor impulses allows for vasodilation. Now, it doesn't cause it specifically, but what it does is to allow it because those vasoconstriction signals are no longer coming in. Now, what happens next is the combination of these two things cause the cardiac output to drop and resistance to drop. And these two together return blood pressure to its normal homeostatic range. Okay, so this is the flip side of what happened in the previous slide. So in this case, the blood pressure has fallen below the normal range. And in this case, the baroreceptors in the carotid sinuses and the aortic arch get inhibited. And what this means is this is going to cause a stimulation of the cardioacceleratory center and an inhibition of the cardioinhibitory center. So if you think of this in terms of the autonomic nervous system, basically the sympathetic impulses get increased, the parasympathetic get decreased. And so these increased sympathetic impulses are going to do a number of different things. If you look at 4A, the increased sympathetic impulses are going to cause an increased heart rate, an increased contractility, therefore an increased cardiac output. At the same time, vasomotor fibers in major blood vessels and also in arterioles are going to cause vasoconstriction, and this will increase systemic vascular resistance. And so the increase in cardiac output and the increase in resistance are going to raise your blood pressure back to its homeostatic range. So let's take a look at the chain of events that happens when a decreased blood pressure activates the cardiac centers in the medulla. First of all, you have decreased parasympathetic center activity, and what this is going to do is this is going to allow the heart rate to rise. Secondly, you're going to get increased sympathetic center activity, and this is going to do a couple of different things. First of all, it's going to directly increase the heart rate. Secondly, it's going to increase the contractility of cardiac muscle. This is going to cause a decrease in the end stroke volume. So in other words, the amount of blood that's left over in the heart after a ventricular contraction will be lessened. This in turn increases stroke volume. So now heart rate has been increased, stroke volume has been increased as well. But that's not the only thing that increased sympathetic center activity will do. It will also raise the levels of epinephrine in the bloodstream. This will cause also an increased contractility of cardiac muscle and will also increase the heart rate in and of itself. While all of this is going on, you're going to see increased activity of the respiratory pump. So in other words, the ventral body cavity, that's going to be the thoracic cavity and the abdominal pelvic cavity, the pressure on the blood vessels there is going to increase. If you're in motion, you're going to see increased activity of the skeletal muscles moving blood through veins. So all of this in this box is about increased movement of blood through the veins. This is going to increase venous return to the heart. This will increase end diastolic volume, and this will consequently increase stroke volume. So basically, if there's more blood in the ventricle to begin with, you have an increased stroke volume. So with all these mechanisms, stroke volume has been increased, heart rate has been increased, and then what you're going to see as a result of this is an increased cardiac output. Higher stroke volume, higher heart rate. Higher cardiac output means a higher blood pressure. So all of these mechanisms will combine to increase the blood pressure, Okay. Now the next thing that I want to talk about is baroreceptor reflexes, and we'll get to an explanation of the diagram on the right in just a little bit. So first of all, let's talk about this orthostatic hypotension. So hypo meaning low. This is a drop in blood pressure when you move from being supine to upright quickly, or maybe from sitting to standing quickly. In most cases, this usually affects the elderly, but it's also going to affect younger people who are ill, and this can be as a cause of dehydration, which is something that I know pretty well, and this can also be as an effect of medication. Now, one other way that you can get, okay, so I should say this first, that orthostatic hypotension can cause dizziness, and it can also cause syncope, which is the loss of consciousness due to a drop in blood pressure. Now, the diagram on the right is showing you carotid massage. So basically, if you'll recall, pressure in the carotid sinuses will stimulate baroreceptors because it's an indication of high blood pressure. If you rub on the carotid sinus, or if you press on the carotid sinus, then you can simulate high blood pressure, and basically what's going to happen is your cardiovascular system is going to respond by slowing the heart rate. This is something that can be useful if someone is going through something like atrial flutter or tachycardia. But the problem that you run into is because it reduces blood pressure, you can cause dizziness or you can cause syncope. So this is something that you have to be pretty well trained in order to use, and even well-trained people tend to be a little hesitant to use a carotid massage. Okay, so we've talked about baroreceptors. The next thing I'd like to talk about is chemoreceptors. And so chemoreceptors are found in the carotid and the aortic bodies. They're located close to the baroreceptors. And so if we take a look at this diagram, you can see here the location of the baroreceptors, and located very close to them, you're going to see the chemoreceptors. So what chemoreceptors do is to detect chemical changes in the blood, and these are going to be changes in oxygen and in carbon dioxide and in hydrogen ions. And from this you can get increased impulses to cardiovascular centers if you've got decreased oxygen, if you've got increased carbon dioxide, or if you've got an increased hydrogen ion concentration, which is going to cause acidosis. So any of these three are going to result in a rise in heart rate, because what good does raising your heart rate and your cardiac output do? Well, if you've got decreased oxygen, what you're trying to do is you're trying to bring more oxygen in from the lungs faster. If you have increased carbon dioxide, you're trying to dump as much carbon dioxide into the lungs as possible. So in both cases, you're going to see an accelerated heart rate and an increase in the rate of respiration. With hydrogen ion concentration, one of your main outlets for getting rid of hydrogen ions is through the kidneys. And so if you increase cardiac output, you're going to increase filtration in the kidneys. So basically you'll have more blood plasma leaving the bloodstream to enter the kidneys, and as a result of this, more hydrogen leaves the bloodstream, goes into the filtrate in the kidneys, and will eventually be urinated out. Okay. In addition, you increase sympathetic output to peripheral arterioles and veins, and so you're going to increase blood pressure. And the whole point behind increasing blood pressure is that you increase velocity. So again, you're trying to get oxygen to the tissues faster. You're trying to get carbon dioxide out of the tissues faster. You're trying to get hydrogen ions away from tissues faster. So the point here behind increased blood pressure is really increased blood velocity. So at this point, the cardiovascular center will also send impulses, as I mentioned, to the respiratory center in the brain. So you'll increase the rate of breathing, which means you'll increase your oxygen intake. But because of that pump in the thorax and abdomen, you're also going to increase venous return. So when you increase venous return, you increase the volume of blood and therefore cardiac output. So again, raise blood pressure, raise cardiac output. What you're hoping to do is to increase your oxygen intake, increase the rate at which you dump CO2, and increase the rate at which you dump hydrogen ions. Okay, so there are a number of ways that hormonal regulation of blood pressure occurs. First of all, you've got four major mechanisms. You've got what's called the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone pathway, which we'll examine in a little bit more detail. You have antidiuretic hormone, epinephrine and norepinephrine, and you have atrial natriuretic peptide. So the first of these is the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone. And what you're going to see happen is decreased blood flow will be detected by the kidneys. If you'll take a look at the diagram here, by these cells called the juxtaglomerular cells. Now, in response to decreased blood flow, what these juxtaglomerular cells will do is to secrete renin. What renin does is to convert angiotensinogen that is present in the bloodstream to angiotensin 1 and to angiotensin 2 in the bloodstream. So you have this circulating protein already present in the bloodstream that's ready and waiting for renin to be applied to it. So how do you convert angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2? I mentioned that renin will convert angiotensinogen to angiotensin 2, but that's not really the major way in which you get angiotensin 2. The main way in which you get angiotensin 2 is through angiotensin converting enzyme, or ACE. You may have heard commercials for ACE inhibitors, and so we'll explain the implications of ACE inhibitors in just a little bit. Okay, angiotensin 2 causes peripheral vasoconstriction. You'll raise resistance, you'll raise blood pressure. So this is going to be all over the entire body. And so why would you want to decrease this? If you have high blood pressure, then an ACE inhibitor can help lower your blood pressure. Also, this gets recommended sometimes for people with diabetes because in many cases, people with diabetes have increased filtration rate in their kidneys, and taking an ACE inhibitor will actually reduce the strain that's on the kidneys in diabetics. So what angiotensin 2 also does is to cause the adrenal medulla to increase its secretion of aldosterone. So in addition to its effects on vasoconstriction, you also increase the secretion of aldosterone. And what aldosterone does is to have specific effects on the kidneys. So you're going to get an increased reabsorption of sodium by the kidneys and more secretion of potassium into the urine. Now, when you increase reabsorption of sodium by the kidneys, then by osmosis, water follows the sodium back into the bloodstream. So you increase your volume of blood. So when we're looking at angiotensin, how does angiotensin affect blood pressure? Well, first of all, it'll raise it by vasoconstriction, which increases resistance, which increases blood pressure. I'm sorry, vasoconstriction, which increases blood velocity. Um, Secondly, you have an increased retention of water by the kidneys. You increase blood volume, you increase blood pressure. So both of these are ways in which angiotensin II increases blood pressure. Okay, now antidiuretic hormone, the previous system here that we saw, um, renin, angiotensin, aldosterone, is triggered by low blood pressure. Antidiuretic hormone is also triggered by decreased blood volume. Now, decreased blood volume will usually result in decreased blood pressure. Okay, so ADH can also be triggered by angiotensin II. So here's another effect of the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. So ADH, as you know from last semester, is produced by the hypothalamus, released from the posterior pituitary. I'm sorry, you know it from this semester. And this causes the increase in water absorption by the kidneys. The exact mechanism of this we'll save for the urinary system chapter, but it does cause the increase in water reabsorption by the kidneys. And this is actually a sodium independent mechanism. That's why it says pure water reabsorption. Okay, now as you increase your water reabsorption by the kidneys, blood pressure will rise as blood volume increases. So this is how antidiuretic hormone works. And if you look at the name of it tells you exactly what it does. A diuretic is a chemical that increases urination, and so antidiuretic would be something that decreases urination by increased water reabsorption. Okay, epinephrine and norepinephrine are produced, as you already know, by the adrenal medulla. And what these are going to do is to increase blood pressure by increasing heart rate and cardiac contractility, and also increasing vasoconstriction of peripheral blood vessels. So you increase your cardiac output, you increase your vascular resistance. Both of these are going to increase blood pressure. Okay, so I'm sorry. Let me talk about the previous slide for just a second. That is also a response to low blood pressure. Now we have a response to high blood pressure, which is atrial natriuretic peptide. And so this is another hormone where the name of it tells you what it does. Atrial, meaning that it's released by myocardial cells in the atria, and natriuretic, well, this decreases blood pressure by causing vasodilation for one, but mainly by increasing salt loss by the kidney into the urine. So what you don't get is a lot of reabsorption of salt back into the bloodstream with water following. Instead, salt stays in the tubules of the kidney, doesn't come back into the bloodstream, exits via urine, and water will follow the salt. Now, natriuretic refers to the Latin or Roman name for sodium, which is natrium. That's the reason why sodium has the chemical symbol Na. So natriuretic means that you excrete more sodium through the urinary system, and as a result, you excrete more water along with it. The last type of regulation of blood pressure is localized, and this is autoregulation of blood pressure. This is where you get local changes in capillary beds, and this is when a tissue adjusts its blood flow to match the tissue's needs. So there are a couple of different ways that this can happen. One is increased flow in a capillary bed, and in this diagram of the capillary bed, you can see that there's blood flow all the way through the capillary bed, from the arteriole to the venule. So how do you get this? How do you get increased blood flow in a capillary bed? You get the vasodilation of arterioles, and you get the relaxation of what are called capillary sphincters. If you look at the diagram here, do you see where the graphic, or where the bracket, big bracket that says capillary bed is? Look up at the top of that and you'll see a label that says precapillary sphincters relaxed, and these are portions of smooth muscle that can constrict and completely block off portions of the capillary bed as needed. So what does it look like when that happens? It looks like this. Decreased flow in a capillary bed. So if you'll notice, you've got one sort of main vessel called a med-arteriole that goes from the arteriole to the venule, but the blood flow here is bypassing the capillaries because these capillary sphincters, these precapillary sphincters, have actually contracted and blocked blood flow into those capillaries. So basically you get vasoconstriction of arterioles, lessening blood flow to the entire capillary bed in the first place. But even with that reduced blood flow, you get the constriction of precapillary sphincters, which is going to really drop the amount of blood going into those capillaries. Whenever you have redistribution of blood, say during a fight or flight reflex, you may have noticed that somebody gets really pale when they get really angry. They may turn pale, or when they get really scared, they'll turn pale. And the reason why is because this autoregulation is happening a whole lot in the skin in those areas. Now, one other thing is this. So you may have noticed that if you go outside and your hands, when it's really cold, your hands get pale, your face gets pale. When you come back in, then your hands and your face will flush. And this flushing will actually be due to autoregulation in blood pressure, where the arterioles open up just as wide as they possibly can, and these precapillary sphincters relax as much as they possibly can. And the point here is to increase blood flow into those tissues to get them warmed back up again, and also to deliver oxygen and nutrients to them that they've been missing while they haven't been getting blood. Okay, so whenever you want to warm a certain part of the body, you carry out vasodilation. Whenever you want to cool a certain part of the body, then you'll carry out vasoconstriction, and this is where this becomes useful. Now, there is one more thing called the myogenic response, and that is when an arteriole contracts on its own in response to stretching. So if you've had a high blood pressure situation, whether it's permanent or whether it's temporary, if you stretch an arteriole out consistently enough, it's going to contract its smooth muscle and narrow down. Okay, the final thing is actually chemical responses in terms of autoregulation of blood pressure. And so what are chemical responses? These are chemicals that can serve as either vasodilators or vasoconstrictors. And so with vasodilators, basically you're going to be increasing the lumen of the blood vessel, and that's what you can see happened from left to right in this diagram. And what are some common vasodilators? I'm not going to read them all, but nitric oxide gets a lot of publicity, especially amongst people who are into fitness. A lot of the time they'll talk about trying to increase their nitric oxide production so that they get increased blood flow to the muscles that they're trying to work out. Histamine is a very potent vasodilator, as well as being an anticoagulant. And kinins and histamine will kick in when you have inflammation resulting from cell trauma. Under other normal circumstances, you can see in the first bullet point, there are other vasodilators. With vasoconstrictors, you see a constriction of the smooth muscle in the walls of the blood vessel, and that's going to lead to a narrower lumen. And so some common vasoconstrictors are going to be thrombosane, A2, superoxide, serotonin, endothelians. And so you may recall thrombosane A2 as part of the platelet plug formation and clotting response. And so thrombosane A2 is going to be very helpful in terms of repair of blood vessels, because it's going to encourage vasoconstriction, which brings the walls of the affected blood vessel closer together. And this is sort of a final slide here. In here, this shows you intrinsic mechanisms, including autoregulation, and extrinsic mechanisms. And so you can see all of these different things: metabolic controls, myogenic controls, and metabolic controls meaning substances that can cause vasoconstriction or vasodilation on a localized or systemic level. You've also got nerves and hormones. And whenever you see red arrows here, what's going to happen is you're going to get vasoconstriction. And whenever you've got green arrows, these are things that are going to cause vasodilation. So this is sort of your final summary slide, and this will be it for this particular video.